Good morning, creative writers. Today's activity in poetry is with free verse poetry, and I am partial to free verse. It is my favorite. I like to write sort of in stream of consciousness the way I think and randomly, so I don't like to be attached to any rules, requirements, structures, and free verse is just that, very free. Let's talk about what exactly it is. You do not have any set pattern of rhyme or rhythm when you are writing free verse poetry. That does not mean that you can't use rhyme or that you can't consider the rhythm of your poem. It just means that there's no established pattern. There's no rhyme scheme. You're not counting syllables to have every line be a certain number. It's really free and open to whatever you would like to make it, which is why a lot of poets prefer free verse poetry. They don't feel as, constrained by the structure. Also in free verse, you can make it any amount of lines. There are some very famous free verse poems of one line or two lines, and similarly, any amount of stanzas. So remember, stanzas are like paragraphs in poetry. And so there could be a free verse poem of one stanza, 7 stanzas, 3 stanzas. You can make it as long as you want it or need it to be to get your message across. And next, when you're thinking about how you're going to write a free verse poem, since there is no structure, what you really need to think about are your line breaks here. And remember, a line break is where you are pushing the next word down onto the next line. So if you believe that there's a single word that you want to stand alone on a line because you want it to stand out, leave it there and break the rest of the sentence onto the next line. If you want to end a line on a certain word, because maybe by reading it to that line, it gives the readers a certain idea, but then when they go to the next line and finish the thought, it shifts their idea, and you want to manipulate the way they read the poem in that way to have them experience some sort of epiphany. You can do that as a poet with your line breaks. You can also do that with stanza breaks. So think about how having certain words pushed onto the next line might help get your message across that you're trying to get across in your poem. You also need to think about how you're going to weave in those poetic elements that we've been playing with. So where might I want to use figurative language in my free verse poem? Where might I want to use sound devices? Where might I want to really consider my diction, maybe even repetition of diction? So think about that in your free verse, right? Free verse doesn't mean just do whatever you want. Yes, there is no structure, but you still have to be very purposeful, almost more so, because everything is so free. You have to be really thoughtful about what you're going to use as a poet to get this message across effectively to your audience. And I put at the end, yes, they are super fun to write. You have so many options when it comes to free verse, and that's why usually students have a lot of fun with this, is because there's usually enough options so that you find something you like, almost like the ice cream store, right? Plenty of flavors for everyone. So you're going to notice that I posted this document on your assignment because I'd like you to try one of these activities as, your inspiration for a free verse poem today. So we want to consider the types, and just because I've listed some here, that doesn't mean that these are the only ways to get into free verse poetry. These are just some of the common ones, the fun ones, the ones we play with in Creative Writing 1. So let's look through these briefly just to give you some inspiration, give you some examples, and make sure you feel comfortable trying a free verse poem on your own. So you have what we call found poetry. If you've been feeling like it's been difficult to write your own poetry just from your own brain, you're lacking inspiration, maybe being quarantined is not the best situation for you as far as having an imagination or having your creativity be sparking. If that's the case, found poetry is a really great outlet. It really is finding poetry in things that are already around you. So I'm going to show you how to do a blackout poem, how to do a bookbinding poem. We can talk briefly about a collage poem or a magnetic poem. Those are just things that you use resources that are already there for you. They don't have to come just from your head. It really helps, dig out some of that imagination and creativity by using things that are already around you. Then I'll make sure you have the opportunity to consider shape poetry. I did mention that to you at the beginning of this unit with E.E. Cummings' poem, La, that didn't even look like a poem. It was a leaf falling, if you remember. That was shape poetry. I'll show you some examples of that, and you might want to try that. Or just the simple stream of consciousness, regular free verse poetry, where an author just sort of writes how he or she is feeling. A lot of popular poetry books on shelves nowadays, like Milk and Honey, that a lot of you may know of, a lot of that is just stream of consciousness writing, free verse, no particular structure to it, but really powerful because it's almost like you're unfolding your soul onto the page. So the list goes on and on. We could talk forever about free verse, but let's look at some examples of these that I've mentioned here. So these are just some basic examples from very famous authors where it's just regular free verse. There's no type, it's not a shape, it's not, blackout, it's not any of those things I mentioned. They're just regular basic free verse poems. So if after you watch this and you consider all the resources, you're like, you know what, I don't need any way to get into writing it, I have plenty of ideas, I'm just going to write a free verse poem, by all means copy what Walt Whitman or Carl Sandburg does here and just write from your heart, from your head, from both, knowing that there's no pattern of rhyme or rhythm in either. Hopefully you've had a chance to kind of peek at these while I've been talking, and if not, pause the video, go ahead and read them. They're excellent examples of just basic free verse poetry. Moving on. Blackout poetry is always a fun activity to do in class. Since I don't have you in class, I encourage you to try blackout poetry while you're at home. What's cool about it is you take any print, any text that you have that is in print. You can rip a page out of a magazine, you can photocopy a page out of a book. I sometimes take, old worksheets or old, direction sheets from my classroom and just hand them around. You can take anything that's already existing, and what you do is you black out all the words you don't want to use. And by doing that, you leave the words that you do want to use, but they have to make sense in order. And then as a whole, they are a poem, right? So you'll see these examples here: to be a teacher and remain a student. It's really just, if you were to write that out, it could be a one-line poem. You could break it, you could break your lines in different places, certainly. But that comes from blacking out the rest of this article and only leaving these words here. Similarly over here, you can read this one: in order, imagine a life where all your time is spent on things you want. I'm writing to let you know that today is your final day of undefined future. Do what you want. All over the world, people are rewriting their own future, right? That's really cool. That came out of an article by just finding those words. It may sound like it's a little bit difficult, but when you get into it, it's really, really fun. So this is an example. These are two examples of blackout poetry. Let me show you some even more creative examples. Some people who are also just very artistic, visually artistic, they like to try to draw imagery into their blackout poems. So they start by just, putting a box around the words they want. You can see, there's kind of an outline with like maybe a skinny Sharpie of the words that they want, and then they fill in the rest with the image. So if you're somebody who really loves visual art along with written art, I encourage you to have a lot of fun with this and maybe draw some sort of imagery on the page around the words that you want, and have that image just enhance the message of your poem. So here are a couple of those. Pretty cool. But this is blackout poetry. Now, another type of poetry that you might have some fun with, and all you need are books, is called bookbinding poetry. We usually do this in the library in the spring, where you can just go around the library, pull out books, and with the bindings, put them in order to create a poem. So I just did this with books that were on my bookshelf to give you an example, and you put them in order, and just by laying them down like this, there's a poem. And I went ahead and I wrote it over here for you. But it's kind of cool, right? Difficult conversations start with why. Why good people do bad things. I thought it was just me, but it isn't. So kind of works out, right? There's some logic there, feels kind of poetic, and that's what bookbinding poetry is. So you might want to have some fun with this. Take books from around your house, try to put them in order so it makes sense, and then take a picture, and you can upload the picture as your poem, or maybe if you want to just type it, you can certainly type it too. But a really cool way to quote-unquote find poetry with things that you already have. That's bookbinding poetry. Now, another example is magnetic poetry. Um, I have had a set of magnetic poetry on my fridge, almost in every house I've lived in. I have one in my classroom, and I would have let you borrow it had we been there. But in lieu of actually having a set, I did post for you this list of words that comes in one of the magnetic poetry kits, and you can almost use this as your magnetic poetry. I've had students actually cut this sheet up and glue it onto paper as if they were little magnets, or you can just use it and highlight words you want to use and kind of put them together in phrases to make a poem. I actually even have a game of magnetic poetry, and this comes from that game. This is a picture of a poem that came from that game when playing it one night. So this is a way to find poetry with words, like a word list with words that you have around you. Sometimes just looking at a list of words, you can come up with a really cool idea that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise come up with without that list of words. So this is one option for you. You can do magnetic poetry. Now, the more difficult, poetry for a lot of folks that we play with in class is shape poetry. This is when you actually turn the poem into the shape to like kind of imitate or suggest the message that you're trying to convey. So my friend E. Cummings, my favorite poet, who wrote that poem La, A Leaf Fall's Loneliness, also wrote a poem called Grasshopper. Pretty tricky to kind of figure out, but he's trying to imitate a grasshopper hopping around. And you're going to notice that he uses the word grasshopper in rearranged ways to kind of show that this grasshopper is all over the place. But he's really saying grasshopper who, as we look up now, gathering into a grasshopper, leaps, arriving rearrangingly to become grasshopper. Really implying that no matter what shape you take on, you're still yourself, right? Still be yourself. So pretty cool little shape poem. This one is obviously looking like a tornado, a twister. A couple of my favorites that former students of mine have done are here. This idea of purgatory being almost in like jail cell, bar cells. You can definitely pick out certain words within. Really smart here. And then this apple, that is actually more than just the fruit apple, talking about the company, but in the form of an apple. Really cool. So you can see how if you're going to do shape poetry, it's not only about the words you use, but it's about the shape that you put those words in. If you go online, there are resources. If you kind of Google, ways to make shape poetry, there are resources to help you fit it into a specific shape if you're having trouble doing that online, but you really want to try. Or if you want to handwrite it so that it looks that way and take a picture and put it on onto the assignment, that's fine too. So that is shape poetry. So hopefully you have been inspired by one of these examples or one of these types of poetry, or even just the idea of free verse alone inspires you. So it is your turn. No rules, no limitations. You are free to verse your way. I really look forward to seeing what you guys come up with free verse. And if you have any questions or need anything at all, you know where to find me. Talk soon.